All right, thanks a lot for having me. This is peer advised financial decisions, the case of blind leading blind. This is together with Doug Bernheim of Stanford University, Foley Arsoy, who is at Loyola Marymount, and Donna Harris, who's a postdoc at Oxford. The motivation for this project is that we know that people often consult with non-experts like friends and family for advice on their financial decisions. And there's a lot of evidence showing that these kind of interactions, they affect the decisions people end up making. Just yesterday I've seen Page's paper that demonstrates that very nicely. One thing we've also seen in Page's paper is it's not always very easy in field settings to answer the question whether these effects are beneficial or harmful. And the answer isn't obvious either, because in particular, when what's optimal for you depends on your idiosyncratic preferences or on your specific situation, when you talk to somebody else and they have something that's optimal for them, but they are very different from you, if you copy them, you might end up hurting yourself. On the other hand, there is a large experimental economics literature that looks at when groups make decisions, how do these decisions compare to the decisions individuals make? And there's quite some evidence that in these kind of cases, groups tend to make better decisions. So from a prior point of view, we just don't know, and that's the question we want to answer. Does peer communication help or harm decision quality? Importantly, when the best choice depends on idiosyncratic preferences. And what we're going to do is we're going to use decisions about investments that accrue compound interest. So time preferences are the channels through which idiosyncratic preferences are going to matter. And we're going to do a lab experiment with face-to-face communication. Now, I know there's many applied economists in the room, so I want to say a little bit about why we want to do a lab experiment here. So one point you often hear from applied economists is like, who the hell cares about the undergraduates? Well, for financial decisions, they are actually quite an interesting population. So we're going to do this experiment at the University of Birmingham in the UK. They make important financial decisions, and in particular, if they were in the US, if they were having student loans, financial literacy is very important for them, and in particular, compound interest knowledge is very important for them. And they are not very good at this. So in our sample, we give them the standard Anna Maria Lusardi financial literacy questions. And look, similar to the US college-educated population, the fraction of people who get all of them right is 45%. And moreover, one of the reasons why people are interested in peer effects in this setting is this hope that you can educate some people, and then you can use the peer effects to let the benefits from that education disseminate to the rest of the population. And so we're going to talk explicitly to that. But college students are a target demographic for such interventions. So that's just the reason why you shouldn't dismiss a lab experiment. Now, why do we want to do a lab experiment? What are positive reasons? Well, the first, econometrically, peer effects are difficult to identify because of the reflection problem and so on. In a lab experiment, you just get rid of these by exogenously assigning people to treatment. And perhaps the most important reason why we do a lab experiment is that it allows us to very precisely measure the quality of financial decision making. And I'm going to be talking on the next couple of slides what exactly we are doing. I just want to, as a comparison, set up what field studies are usually doing. I don't want to say what they are doing is bad, it's very good. It's very important that we have that. What I want to say is that what we are doing is complementary. So in field data, people often look at how often do people choose dominated alternatives. And it's right, if you choose a dominated alternative, that's bad. The problem is if you choose a non-dominated alternative, that's not necessarily good, because it might be a mismatch with your preferences. Another thing that people look at is directional changes in behavior. Perhaps the median US resident should be saving more. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody should be saving more. Depending, say if you're a college student, you're at a very, you're earning very little compared to your expected lifetime income, you should perhaps be saving a lot. And then another thing that people often use when they assess these financial education interventions is they give people knowledge tests and see whether they start doing better on these knowledge tests. And Doug and I, together with Anna, we have a couple of experiments where we show it's actually very easy to design experiments that make people better at these tests. It's a lot harder to design interventions that change people's behavior for the better. So better performance in these tests doesn't necessarily indicate better decision making because, well, book learning isn't street learning. People, sometimes they don't use their knowledge when making decisions. Okay, so here's what we're going to use to assess the quality of decision making. This is based on this paper I have with Doug and Anna. Specific example from what we're going to do in the experiment. We're going to ask people what amount V received today is as good as receiving 10 pounds invested at 1% compounded daily, and whatever is in the account after 72 days, you'll get that. We elicit that in an incentive compatible way, so we use what's known as a multiple decision list. So we ask people, what would you rather have, 20 pounds today or that investment? Perhaps you prefer 20 pounds today, so we ask you, what about 18 pounds today? As we lower that amount sufficiently much, you're going to say, at some point, I prefer the investment. And so that reveals your valuation to us. To make it incentive compatible, to make it in your own interest to tell us the truth, we say, we're going to randomly choose one of these lines. Whatever you decided for on that line that we randomly chose is what you're going to get. So you better tell us what you really want. We also ask people these kind of questions. We ask them, what amount V received today is as good as receiving $20 in 72 days? Now, if you're good at compound interest calculations, or if you know the rule of 72, which is why we use 72 day delays, you'll see that this is exactly the same opportunity set. This investment compounds to exactly $20 in 72 days. We call the investment description the complex framing of the same problem as this one. We call that the simple framing, where everything is transparent. And the way we assess the quality of decision making is by looking at how different are the answers that people give us to these types of to these equivalent questions. And the idea is somebody who really understands compound interest and uses that knowledge when making decisions, they should give us the same answer in both. The extent to which their answers deviate, that's a measure of lacking financial decision quality. We can be more precise about what exactly this is that we're measuring here. If we are willing to make a very stark assumption that I'm going to relax on the next slide, if we are willing to make the assumption that whatever people tell us in the simple frame reveals their true preferences, then we can interpret this absolute deviation in valuations for the same decision, for the same future amount across frames. We can interpret that as the maximal possible welfare loss you could sustain from having a misunderstanding. That's easy to see in an example. So suppose I present you with some investment, and in a simple frame you say you think it's worth to you $15. That's when you understand what you're getting. And when it's presented to you in a complex frame, perhaps because you underestimate the power of compound interest, you think it's worth only $10 to you. Now suppose somebody comes along and offers you that investment in the investment frame, so you don't quite understand what it entails, at a price of $10.01. Well, you're going to say no thank you, right? Because you think it's worth only $10 to you. You're giving up an opportunity that you would have valued at 15 had you understood what you're getting, right? So you gave up $5. That's the difference between your valuation in the simple and the complex frame for this problem. Now, generally, the assumption that in the simple frame you reveal your true preferences is, of course, very stark. In particular, say in the domain of time, we know people have biases like present bias, and some people think we should. What's truly welfare relevant is the decisions people would make if they didn't have present bias and so forth. And so, in such cases, even what people tell us in a simple frame doesn't reveal their true preferences to us. So what can we say in that case? Well, intuitively, it actually doesn't matter very much. The reason is, if you really understand the financial concept,
compound interest say? You're going to give us the same valuation both in the complex and in the simple frame. Now, both of these valuations are affected by your present bias. So the level of these valuations is off. But if you understand what you're doing, the valuations should be the same. And that's a point, and I don't think I'm going to go through the maths here, but that's a point you can make formally. So what you can show is that if people make decisions according to some utility function that you can observe, but that involves some bias, and you think they should rather make decisions according to some other utility function that is unbiased, but that unfortunately you can't observe, and then you look at what's the ratio of these valuation differences across the frames. Well, it turns out that in a first order approximation, this converges to a constant, which in words means that the welfare loss that we observe, even when people have biases, additional biases, that perhaps we don't even know quite what they are, is proportional to the true welfare loss that people sustain up to a first order approximation. So what this means is that, suppose you do some intervention, say, talking to peers, and you find that financial decision quality according to this measure that we can observe, well, their loss decreases by half. Well, the level of the loss might be off, but because it's the right measure up to proportionality, it means also according to, if people didn't have these biases, the loss would also decrease by a half, right? So you get the right kind of measure. Okay, so let's use this stuff to assess the effects of peer communication. The first question is going to be, does peer communication help or harm? And I'm going to show you in our setting it ends up helping people, which raises a couple of other questions. One is, what is the extent of that improvement? Is it that people can just identify others who know better and mimic them? Or do they actually learn something that they can apply to novel problems? The second question we want to answer is, between whom is communication more or less beneficial, depending on people's initial decision quality. And then finally, one of the reasons why people are interested in peer effects is using them as to disseminate the beneficial effects of financial education. So to what extent is this something that actually works in an experiment? Okay, so here's the design. In stage one, people make these choices. There are various of these compound interest problems. For each of them, we ask people's valuations. For each of them, we ask for the valuation twice, once in the simple frame, once in the complex frame. People don't know that there's any equivalencies between these problems, and they're shown in totally random order. They make these decisions in private. Then they get up, go to somebody else, sit down, talk to them face to face. We give them a sheet with some more problems that we tell them you're going to have to decide about in stage two, and you can now discuss those for 15 minutes. You can discuss with each other how you would make these decisions. And then people make these decisions. After going back to their own terminals, they make these additional decisions in private. Okay, now there's maybe people become better because they actually learn something from talking to others. Maybe they become better because they've thought about it for a longer amount of time. So we need a control condition. And in the control condition, everything basically works the same, except people don't get up and talk to each other. They just receive the sheets with the decision problems, and we tell them, you now have 15 minutes, and you can think about how you would make decisions, and once you're done, you continue to stage two and actually make those decisions. We want to know to what extent the beneficial effects of peer communication will apply to novel problems, as opposed to just helping people for the very specific problems that they have discussed. Simple to do, right? Give them some novel problems, give them the problems they have discussed. Then there's an initial stage, which is going to be useful for identification. What it also helps us do is, some people, they first make decisions and choice problems, then they get an education intervention about compound interest. And we've put in a lot of work to make sure that this is actually an effective education intervention, one that actually helps people make better decisions. And then we can look at what if we have somebody talk to somebody who participated in the intervention? Do they aim directly? And just to make sure that the experiment takes the same amount of time for everybody, those who don't get the education in that time, they watch some unrelated documentary. So I'm going to show you the data from 263 subjects we got at the University of Birmingham. We are looking at one person per pair. That was determined randomly at the beginning of the experiment. So we actually ran twice as many subjects as that. The mean payment is £27. As I said, the financial competence is our dependent variable, and I'll normalize everything such that as if the future value of each investment was £1.
Just a clarification question. Did you tell them the true present value? Because the rule of 72 is inaccurate. It's more like 20.4. So were they told
Yes.
true value and that was an option as well?
So in the simple frame, we told them, so we use the true value. If they use the rule of 72, most people don't. Only those in the education intervention, they start using it.
And the intervention video is clear that it's an approximation, but for these numbers it's sufficiently...
It's sufficiently close. Like compared to how far off people are when they don't get education, the approximation is very, very good. And we made sure to choose the problems and numbers such that the approximation isn't too far off. Okay, so first, just to check, does communication help or hurt decision quality? So these are people in the solitary condition. They don't talk to anybody, and you can see they, for some reason, become slightly better off. Perhaps because they got practice. Perhaps because the problems here are slightly different than over here. You can see the baseline loss is 25%. So what this means is that you would get that, say, if in the simple frame you tell me you value something at £20, and in the complex frame you think the same thing is worth to you £15 only, right? That's a 25% deviation. For people who communicate, they start off at about the same level, but they improve to a significantly larger extent. The diff in F is highly statistically significant. So peer effects are beneficial in this setting. Now, is this because people just learn for the very specific things they've discussed, or can they generalize? Let's split up the graph I've just shown you into the discussed problems and the knowledge problems. So what I've shown you is driven partly by the discussed questions. Here's the control subjects who didn't talk to anybody for the novel questions. Now, if people cannot generalize, we should see that the red line is going to lie on top of the blue line. If they can generalize, this will come out. People significantly improve also for the novel question. They seem to have learned something that they can generalize to novel problems. Okay, now between whom is communication most or least beneficial? The first hypothesis that many people have when they think about peer communication and information transmission is that, well, it's just, if I have some information, you don't have some information, we talk, but then you have the information as well, right? So in that case, we would expect the better your partner, the more you improve. But there's an alternative. Learning something mildly conceptual as how to use compound interest, you got to understand, it's not just information that you transmit. You have to understand how to use that. And perhaps that transmission is going to be more effective when people are more similar to each other, because they essentially speak the same language. They can address each other's concern at the right level and pace. They can find out what exactly it takes to make the other person understand. They're not afraid to ask questions, for instance. And so in that case, it might be that similarity is so important that even pairs who are both amongst the less financially able, they do better than a less financially able person improves when they talk to a more financially able person, because communication would be less effective in that sense. So to analyze that, I'm going to split our pairs into 4 groups. depending on whether the person we are looking at is initially in the better or worse half of decision makers, and depending on whether the partner they're talking to is initially in the better or worse half of decision makers. I'm going to look at how people improve from stage 1 to stage 2. For classification, we use the stage 0 decisions. So whatever I'm going to show you is not going to be driven by something like regression to the mean. Okay, so on the left you see people who are initially themselves in the better half of decision makers. On the right it's people initially in the worse half of decision makers. The line you're seeing are those in the control treatment. Those who were initially in the better half, they are also much better in stage 1 and stage 2 than those who were initially in the worse half. Now, let's see what happens when they talk to somebody who is initially in the better half. So those who themselves are initially in the better half, they just have very little room to improve. There's nothing going on really. For those who initially are in the worse half of decision makers, when they talk to somebody who is in the better half, they do improve. And now the question is, what happens when they instead talk to somebody who is in the worse half? If the information transmission story is right, then we should see that this red line is going to be flatter than the green line, right? You improve to a lesser extent when you talk to somebody who has less information. If the similarity story is the right one, then we should see that the red line is at least as steep as the green line, or perhaps steeper, because it's the similarity that allows for effective transmission. And indeed, we do find a statistically significant effect. People are, they improve to a larger extent if they talk to somebody else who is, if they are in the worst half of decision makers, they improve to a larger extent if they talk to somebody who is also in the worst half of decision makers. We can dig into the reasons why that is the case, because we recorded all the conversations, we transcribed them, and we had RA's code what's in those communications. So first, just as kind of a sanity check, we asked our transcribers to highlight if the pairs discuss being similar by saying something like, I'm bad at this too, let's see whether we can help each other out. And you can see that pairs that we classify as similar, they mention something like this 80% of the time. That's twice as high than amongst pairs that we classify as dissimilar according to their behavior. Now, how are the discussions different? Similar pairs actually discuss substantially longer, and that's not because they engage in more small talk. If anything, they engage in less small talk. And they discuss about the same number of problems. So it seems to be the case that they just discuss everything in more depth. So information transmission is more effective. Okay, so between whom is communication most or least beneficial? It's similarity that's really important in our setting, even if the cost of similarity is that your partner is among the less effective half of decision makers. Now we can look at to what extent can we exploit these peer effects to have the effects of financial education diffused through the population. And one thing that might already hint at something that might be problematic is when you educate some people, they are now no longer similar. And if similarity is really important, maybe transmission isn't going to work so well. So we are looking at the indirect effect of education. So first, let me tell you what the direct effect is. People who participate in the intervention, in stage 1 they have a competence of -0.19. Those who don't, in stage 1 they have a competence of -0.27. So that's about a third difference. So there is the intervention is effective. Now let's look at the indirect effects. These are people who discuss with somebody who participated. They didn't participate themselves. The red lines are the lines you've seen before. That's just when you talk to somebody who didn't participate. The green lines are when you talk to somebody who did participate in the intervention. Now the levels are slightly different, but you can see there's the slopes are about similar, both when you talk to somebody who participated and when you talk to somebody who didn't participate. So clearly, it's not the case that the intervention has significant indirect benefits to those who didn't participate. And we can also see something about why that might be the case, or what the indirect education is doing. The green line here is a little steeper than the red line, and the green line here is a little flatter than the red line. The difference in these slopes is statistically significant. So it looks like what education does is it makes people a little better at improving for exactly the things they have discussed, but it makes it harder for them to generalize that knowledge. And, well, one of the reasons might be that the nature of transmission is now different. So we see that when we look at the pairs who highlight similarities between each other, well, that significantly drops from an average of 60% to an average of about 40%. And one of the reasons I didn't show you, I didn't put the numbers, but sometimes people will say something like, "I know better, just follow me." And that happens more often when one of the people got educated. So they use a technique like, that's called proof by intimidation. Another thing that you see, as I said, the education intervention focuses on the rule of 72 because that's a simple thing. You don't need to know exponentials for that. Now, a number of people amongst our subjects, they know the compound interest rule. So you can estimate it's about, we didn't ask specifically because we didn't want to prime subjects, but estimating from the pairs who discussed the compound interest formula, it's about 37% of individuals who initially know the compound interest formula. Now, how many pairs do discuss that formula with each other? Well, if you talk to somebody who didn't get the education, it's 60%, and that drops once you talk to somebody who got educated. What really increases is the fraction of people who talk about the rule of 72. And it seems to be the case that the rule of 72 for people is either harder to apply or harder to explain. It seems to be the case that we have an ineffective tool crowding out a more effective tool. And that leads to the indirect benefits of education being quite limited. All right, so can financial education effectively diffuse through peer communication? Well, it indirectly helps a little bit through better mimicking, but it doesn't lead to better comprehension that people can generalize. And of course, this is probably specific to the context we are using because compound interest is a mildly conceptual topic. If we had something that is very simple, like there exist tax-deferred savings accounts, well, then probably the information story would be right, but we could probably regard this as a lower bound of how conceptual something needs to be so that the indirect benefits of education start to become difficult to observe. And that's already all I have. I'm faster than I thought. But just to see, here's an example from our conversations. A person says, the pie is a good example, and B says, yes, that was much easier. I have no idea how somebody would think of using a pie to explain compound interest, but apparently that seemed to be exactly the right thing for that person. They said, you've just taught me much more math than I've ever learned ever. The person
doesn't know what maths is.
They don't know what math is, but also, if they had talked to an expert, I think experts wouldn't have been very likely to use that kind of example that happened to help that person a lot, highlighting the effects of or importance of similarity. All right.
So it's a great pleasure to read this. Let me do the following. I want to talk about the very big picture that's being discussed here because I think this is why this is an important paper, and then I'll talk about some specifics about the paper itself. This is a big paper, an important paper in what I believe is one of the most important developments in recent years, behavioral normative welfare economics. And it's something that we're spending a lot of time on, many others have done as well. So it fits into that broader methodological challenge. So let's talk about it, what that challenge involves. The core methodological challenge is, how do you do good old-time welfare economics when we don't believe in the naive revealed preference? Okay? That's a tough question. They're providing one alternative, and there are a few others that are around, and I want to position their work in the context of some other work that's done here, and we can see the strengths and maybe some limitations of what they've done. I'd like to stress, particularly since this is a finance crowd, and this is one of the things that I'm very concerned about in a lot of finance applications, it's not just revealed preference. I want to use the word preference in the broader sense of savage to refer to both your utility, your rankings of alternatives in terms of utility functional and your beliefs. And indeed, when I go to finance seminars in GSU, I wear this t-shirt. What would savage say? In other words, the 600-pound gorilla in the room, the big confound that nobody does anything with, is subjective beliefs. We might have a survey question, throw that out. There's massive hypothetical bias in those things. Nobody is controlling for subjective beliefs. Yes, there are assumptions such as irrational expectations, assumptions that give us some structure that we can use to make some progress, but that's the big gorilla that's going around just being ignored completely. Not just in finance, I mean it's also true in most of economics and most of development. But I'm concerned about both of those things, and in most of my work, this turns out to be the most significant confound to get a handle on. So here's a number of suggestions that we get from the literature, and then I'll talk about precisely the work that Doug and that Sandro is doing, as well in his other work. There are various suggestions for how we can address this challenge. The first from the nudges is, don't worry about it, since it's obvious what's better. The problem with nudging is its unconditionality. For example, I'll give you an area that concerns me passionately, and that is take-up of insurance products. Very often we're seeing people should buy an insurance product if it's actuarially fair and if they're risk averse. Notice I said if they're risk averse. You don't know that Stephen's risk averse. What if there's a positive loading on the insurance premium? Then it's not obvious that Stephen should purchase it. So you can't unconditionally nudge him to buy this product without knowing the degree of his risk aversion. Do any of the nudgers ever give a damn about that? No. The problem with nudging is its unconditionality. Nothing wrong with talking about choice architecture. We've got another name for that. It's called mechanism design. But choice architecture is rich and valuable for certain purposes if you know what direction to nudge somebody in. That's the problem. We have to have some knowledge. You can maybe, there's an undercurrent here, and I'm going to say we need some structure and, God forbid, some theory. We're going to need some latent theory here to guide us. So that's the problem with the nudgers here. The problem with the randomistas, the Duffel-Bees and the others doing randomized controlled trials, is they only do cost-effectiveness analysis. They'll tell you if we're going to reduce infant mortality in Zimbabwe, what's the most cost-effective way to do that. That's extraordinarily valuable, but it ain't cost-benefit analysis. It doesn't tell me if I'm going to allocate $1 of aid, do I allocate the aid to infant mortality or to education of girls or to something else? That's fine. I'm not throwing that baby out with the bathwater. That's hard-earned information. It's valuable, but don't pretend to me that that's a substitute for being able to do welfare analysis in the full cost-benefit sense. Then there are some very important theoretical proposals. One is that we should build structural models, and we should model the deviations from some inner rational preferences. So that, for example, is the literature that works about thinking about people making decisions under risk or over time where they have some Fechner error, they have some tremble, or they have some theory about why they don't follow the deterministic preferences that are latent. So if you've got a structure for that, you can take that structure away inside and say, what's the inner core preference that John has? And those will be the basis. So you're cleaning up, so to speak, his observed noisy preferences. Of course, that relies on some structure, some latent structure about how noise gets into his decision making. But that's one approach. Another approach stressed by Bob Sugden, amongst others, is preferences are all over the place. I disagree with that, but preferences are all over the place. We can't get reliable measures of these things. So let's just focus on the opportunity set. Now, as far as it goes, there's nothing wrong with that. The trouble is it doesn't go very far. Exactly a point that Sandro stressed, and he stressed in the paper, and I agree completely. The real challenge comes when good choices, your welfare evaluation depends on what are your preferences, whether it's a risk preference or a time preference. That's the real challenge here. So that's one approach, but I think it's very, very, very limited. Another approach is to find choice settings where preferences are not needed or only minimal preference axioms are needed. This is one that Sandro mentioned when you've got, for example, first order stochastic dominance. There's a lot of literature on this. That's kind of interesting, but again, it's extremely limited. It doesn't tell us, it doesn't generalize, it doesn't tell us the broader applications. Then there's another approach which we've been working on that we, with brilliant marketing skills, call it sophisticated revealed preference. So you can't be against it, right? You can sophisticated revealed preference. This is naive revealed preference. Intuitively, the idea here is I need an independent metric of, let's focus on risk preferences or time preferences, whichever you want. I need an independent metric of John's risk preferences in order to evaluate his choices over risky prospects. If I'm evaluating his choices over insurance, whether he buys insurance or not, and I use his choices over insurance to estimate his risk preferences, guess what the maximum likelihood is going to do? It's going to explain why those were correct choices. That's its job. That's what maximum likelihood means. It says, let's find the R in the coefficient of relative risk aversion that explains why he did the right thing. That's just another name for a direct, naive, revealed preference. So normatively, I must have some independent metric to evaluate his choices. So what we do is we give him a separate choice, an abstract risk aversion choice, standard in experimental economics. I estimate his risk preferences here, and I use those to evaluate his insurance choices. I put my hand up, but I'm assuming that his risk preferences here are the same that should be used normatively here, and there's some interesting issues there which we've discussed in our papers. The nice thing about this approach is it is general. It's got a big assumption. I was always taught by my earliest teachers, if you make an assumption, that's fine, make a heroic assumption, but put your hand up and keep your hand up, because keeping your hand up tires you. You should not forget that you've made that assumption. So I'll try to do that for a while whilst we're talking about this. The nice thing about this is it's general. Bad news is, because a lot of people do this methodological finger wagging, you need structural theory. And we want to be agnostic about theory, don't we? No, I don't actually, because I need some latent theory to do anything worth a damn. The other thing that's important is that Mark has just literally 2 days ago finished writing his PhD thesis, congratulations, on 3 interventions to look at financial literacy using this approach. So it's one that generalizes precisely to financial literacy as well. Okay, so what are these guys doing? The first paper in the stream was by Doug and Antonio on the choice theoretic foundations of behavioral welfare economics. I've got to admit, I'm Australian, but I'm not stupid. When I read this paper, I had no clue how to operationalize it. I got it. You can't use reveal preference. We figured that out all by ourselves. That's good, and that's well stated, it's correct. And I challenge you. I've challenged Doug. I can't challenge Antonio, he just talks loud. But the point is, I've challenged them to sort of say, how do you operationalize it? They didn't answer, to my satisfaction. Then there's another survey paper, basically, by Doug, repeating the same arguments here. And then this paper came out 2014. I love this paper, and I really mean this, and I've sort of communicated with them privately. For the first time, I actually got a sense, this is the precursor to the one you were referencing, I'll talk about it in a moment, I actually got a sense, oh, that's what they meant. Here's how you operationalize it, and that's what we're looking at today. There's a subsequent version of this in 2017 with a different title, and I can guess from your talking about quasi-hyperbolic discounting what the referees were telling you in between. That wasn't me, but I can imagine it. This is actually important, and I'll reference the difference here between the 2014 paper a little bit later. And then we come to the current paper. All 3 of these are using exactly the same task, the time discounting task. The first couple of papers, sadly, were using Amazon turkeys, so I find those sort of silly data sets to look at. Now you're looking at real humans, which I think is an excellent thing to do. So let's look at this one here. Let me get straight to the specifics. Here are the questions. Consider these two statements. What I'm doing is I'm choosing a specific example. They had several periods here, 46 I think was the other one, or 48, and different numbers here and different percentages. But this is, I just want to use one very, very concrete one. Here's the simple statement. You'll receive $88 in 72 days. What's the present amount that's equivalent to that? Or, we'll invest $22 at 3% interest, compounded daily for 72 days, and you'll receive the amount at the end. What's the present amount that's equivalent to that? Simple and complex. One thing I do want to note, in many of the instances, if I'm not mistaken, you have an order effect, that people did this first and did this later, if I'm not mistaken, at least in some of the subjects. If I've misunderstood, then I've misunderstood. If there's an order effect, you need to worry about that. But
it's completely randomized at the individual level. So some people, yes,
okay,
they will see one first, but others will see the other first.
Excellent, excellent. We want to see if there's an order effect, then that's good. I just didn't see that in the paper, but I completely accept what you're saying. So here's the questions. What's the present amount? What they then do is they elicit this valuation using what's called an iterative multiple price list, which Sandro went through. This is something that Stefan Morton and I developed some years ago. The idea is, he showed you a picture. What you do is, you've got a certain amount of money here, that's the present value, and you've got this or this on the right-hand side, and you switch at a certain point. They enforce switching. And then, since the first grid is maybe 10 tokens, they go down to plus or minus 1 token. That's the iterative part. So they get very refined estimates of this present value. And this is an incentive compatible and relatively straightforward method of eliciting these values. But here's the key interpretation point. The first simple frame reveals true valuations. My asterisk here is to do with the 2017 paper, and the point that he's making about Theorem 1. One thing to notice about Theorem 1, and I actually agree with the punchline here, but I don't think the voodoo math is needed, is you've got a limiting argument. As people hold almost none of this instrument, as alpha goes to 0, you've got an approximation. Well, pregnancy ain't marginal. If we're trying to evaluate discrete changes and whether someone buys insurance or doesn't buy, it's not a matter of are you buying it at the margin. So it's useful to have a marginal result. But as long as, if you do not have path independence when you're evaluating welfare, go read your Bodway Bruce, old-time welfare economics. It's an old religion. If you don't have path independence, marginal effects are not the same as the discrete effects at all. And indeed, you'll rarely have path independence. It's very, very restrictive. Here's the key. And I'm putting an asterisk there because I'm going to go back to the interpretation in 2014 and the interpretation in the current paper. But that's why the asterisk is there. The assumption is that this reveals true valuations and the complex frame reveals illiteracy. One of the things, as they said, is they normalize across different values here so that everything is normalized to a unit scale, just for simplicity to look at the data. Here's the key assumption. This is the core assumption. We're going to assume that an answer of 80 cents for the complex frame and $1 for the simple frame, just that's the data we're assuming. The key assumption is that this implies the subjects would have valued the complex frame at $1 if he properly understood his opportunity set, their language. And they're explicit about this. That's the assumption they're putting up, and they should sort of walk around like this all the time with their hand up. Hold up there, Beavis, for those of you who are Beavis and Butthead fans. I'm not sure that the argument is that these frames are the same thing. They're not. They're not. Done about 20 years of research in time preferences, so let's discuss the problems. Here are the statements, and here's the question. We, that meaning us, the experimenters, know that the amount in the second question is 88. So if you crank the arithmetic out, and Bush is up there to correct us if we got it wrong, it's going to be $88. So let's agree on that. So it's the same $88 there. But here's a linguistic issue. When I first read this, seriously, let's use what's called in linguistics pragmatics. Pragmatics is the part of linguistics that says, how do we actually converse with each other? What are the conventions we use in conversations to converse with each other? I looked at it and I said, this has got to be a trick question. What's the present amount that's equivalent to this? Well, doesn't it have to be 22? In some sense, you've just told me that $22 invested at 3% is such and such. Implicit in my conversational interpretation is that 3% is the market interest rate. Then what I'm saying is that its present value is $22. So the question I then ask is, well, do I have access personally to higher interest rates? This actually raises a deeper methodological issue here with respect to eliciting time preferences. There's a bloke called Fisher. You heard of the Fisher separation theorem. If John faces perfect capital markets, there are professors at Harvard face perfect capital markets, they must, right? His borrowing and savings rates are the same. I cannot elicit his time preferences. I can't elicit them. All I'm eliciting is his knowledge of what his borrowing equals savings rate is. That's called Fisher. Fisher told us that. So it's a well-known point in the experimental literature on eliciting time preferences that only if your borrowing and savings rates give me a gap can I elicit your time preferences in between. Otherwise, I run into what's called a censoring issue. The censoring issue was raised in a really seminal paper by Kohler and Williams. It's not nearly cited enough. We then used it in a subsequent couple of papers. Here's the idea of censoring. Mark, it's late in the day. You don't have a hangover. You don't have a hangover, right? There's a bottle, there's a glass of Cop Black Label Pinotage with your name on it outside there. How much are you willing to pay for it?
One glass?
Yeah, one glass. Come on.
20 US.
20 US. It's a bloody nice wine, let me tell you. A bloody nice wine. Now, let me ask you, Mark. Mark, there's a glass of Cop out there. Oh, by the way, they're selling it for $9.50. How much are you willing to pay for it?
$9.
Thank you, Mark. That's called censoring. Same thing happens with, so the problem you have here is that in both cases, people are guessing at what is the interest rates that I can, the field interest rates outside the lab borrowing opportunity or savings opportunity I can guess at. And unless you know that, you can't make reliable inferences. These are not the same thing because here you've got a scaffold. You've been told something about what the market rate is. And here you've not been told. So these ain't the same frames. That's my point.
So it's daily, right? 3% is a good yearly interest rate.
That's not my point. You're missing my point. You're missing my point. That's not the point. The point is it's a frame that you should think about market interest rates. Whereas here, you're not necessarily thinking about market interest rates. That's the point I'm making. Data. Not nearly enough data. Detail. Here's what we see. We see this histogram of financial things. What they've done is they've normalized and they look at the differences and we see this picture. What are the histograms of the valuations? I've done enough experimental economics to know that when you gave me this $22, I'll bet a whole bunch of people said 22. I would have. I would have. I'm not that I'm representative of anything, but I want to see the raw histograms, no kernel densities, because histograms will show you spikes. I want to see that that's the reason the Lord invented online appendices, that we can have 600 pages of stuff on, right? So I want to see that. I'll bet there's spikes, and I also want to look at the within subject choices, and you're telling me there were lots of those, so I want to see those because they're even more informative. When I see a picture like this, I do a southern thing. I kind of smile and I say, Stephen's done this. This is if I've seen something and I'm really not impressed by these pictures because I don't know what the data's telling me. I look at this and I say, Stephen, bless your heart. That's a southern way of saying, you're really not telling me anything here that I can rely on because I don't know the underlying data. There's not enough data being told to me. The regressions in these pictures are hiding what I'm really interested in. When we got OLS changes, I have general jihads, as you might have sensed, against use of OLS, but I guess we're in a finance world. But we're in the top end of the tail here, but you guys know the bottom end of the finance empirical tail, where just OLS is tossed around willy-nilly. I'm worried about spikes. We also have some work, if I'm not mistaken. We're doing OLS on subject-specific averages over 6 or 12 choices. You can't do regressions on an average. It's a statistic, right? It's not data. Averages are not data. You can't do that. We learned that in undergraduate stuff. Okay, sorry. Final point. What discount rates are implied here? Here's a rule of thumb. I've done this a few decades now. If you're reading this literature, don't even bother reading the hypothetical surveys for reliable data. We've got masses of publications on the hypothetical bias. When discount factors are reported, but not discount rates, it's probably because the rates are embarrassing. And If you calculate the rates and you need scientific notation to report them, they're definitely embarrassing, okay? And that's actually true of the vast literature, in particularly hypothetical, the psych literature, and so forth. There's a couple of reviews. Needless to say, I think that one's more reliable than this one, because these guys, we sent them all the papers that were published, but they just didn't bother to reference them. Funny about that. But this one I think is a little more reliable. Here's the problem. We're told here that the average discount factor was 0.87 for 48 days or 0.84 for 72 days, and that we're told these are comparable to the literature. And there's a little footnote, which I appreciate, but that's about all. These imply annualized discount rates of 190% and 142%. That's kind of large. It's kind of large. Does it sort of ring large to you? And is this comparable to the literature? Well, no. Colin Williams, using US students, and a very, very clean designs, had 20% to 25%. Our AER paper using adult Danes had 28%. Here, both this here and here, we're assuming a linear utility function. So we're showing you the money discount rates. That's actually bad theory. The correct theory is to correct for diminishing marginal utility, because the discount factor is that scalar that equates the present value of the utility stream with the future, of the smaller sooner amount with the present value of the utility stream with the larger later amount. So you've got to correct for diminishing marginal utility, larger later. Jensen's inequality, another beautiful Danish insight, kicks in. It's actually a direct corollary. We get 10%. So that's the number you get in the literature, not 190, 140. So let's be very, very, very clear. We're getting wild time preferences. Finally here, we get a population standard deviation of 0.27. Now, I get it that this is highly skewed data. I mean, I'm going to accept that completely, but crikey, you better show us some of these distributions, because we're talking about wild time preferences, discount rates going all over the place, right? Okay, so let me conclude. What they are doing is tackling a deep and important problem, so I don't want us to forget that. How do we do behavioral economics? They recognize that we need to account for preferences. This is one of the strengths of their work and the work of some others. And let's start in the lab for important reasons. I appreciate Sandro saying, well, you know, you blokes might be wondering why I'm doing it in the lab. I'll tell you why we're doing it in the lab. And again, I've said, we're looking at the better end of the tail of empirical finance in this room. You just look at the crap that's usually done, the atheoretical crap that's usually done by tape spinners. You know who I'm talking about. You know the papers I'm talking about. There's no theory. There's a hand waving here, there's a hand waving there. Not the top end, not the top end. The reason we go into the lab is because we care about getting the theory right so we can actually make inferences. Then we go to the field. Then we go to the field. I'm not saying this is externally valid that we care about students, although in this instance we may well, as Sandro pointed out. We do it so we can get our empirical ducks lined up conceptually, cleanly with theory, then we go to the field. So I appreciate the defense, but I'm going to be even more aggressive in saying let's go back to the lab if we actually want to have some coherent theory behind what we're doing. Here's some limitations. There's an overselling of one method. I've already commented to people. We all do that. We all do that. However, this is such a nascent field, behavioral welfare economics, that we don't need overselling of one method. All of the methods, and I think we've agreed privately about this, have some strengths and limitations. Let's discuss those more clearly. It relies on this key assumption, which I find problematic. There's a lot of data, to be honest, that's simply buried behind the regressions and the cute little pictures. And this happens to me a lot as a referee. I have problems and I say, I'm just not going to look at the regressions because I don't understand where the data has come from. So that's my primary concern here. So this might be just me, but I'd like to see the data. And the final limitation I have here, and it's the one that's most serious, even though I find this particular assumption problematic here, I don't know how this method generalizes, because this method relies on you coming up with two choice frames that you think should give you the same welfare choice, the same welfare implications, but which might lead to different observed choices. That's not obvious how that generalizes. And interestingly, in the entire Bernheim-Rangel work, we've only seen one application, this one application, which is a question as to whether it is indeed independent. So I think that's a concern. There's a great strength here, but notice that weakness as well. Let me leave it there. Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben. Sandro, do you want to take questions or
Okay, yeah, so I want to respond to a couple of points, but thanks for the very nice discussion. So about the method generalizing, this is one of the kind of almost misconceptions we get a lot. It's not just a method about assessing compound interest decision making. We are working on several papers where we generalize this to assessing the quality of portfolio choice. We just ran a couple of experiments there. You can use it to, say you have dynamic trading strategies. If you follow the strategy, that's going to imply a distribution of returns. And so you can look at when you have people value distributions of returns directly, and when you have people choose between dynamic trading strategies, do they get what they like, or are they completely off? So it's a very general method. Now, you are right, it's not obvious how to do that well, and we are writing on a next version of this paper that we first put out in 2014, where we explicitly specify all these assumptions much more clearly than we currently have, and we definitely should do. Clearly what you said about the histograms, I will act on. We certainly should do that. We should be very frank about the data. About the particular time preference thing, for those of you who are familiar with experimental economics, it's a huge discussion about to what extent do choices with money reveal true preferences and to what do they not? And to what extent do people think about interest rates, market interest rate, and to what extent do they not care about those? Jim Andreoni just put a new paper out last month on NBR, and he is on the side of it measures something real. So we can actually, in the first paper, we can actually look at, we ask people, did you use the rule of 72, or did you use compound interest calculations to get your valuations in the complex frame? Did you use the rules to get your valuations in the simple frame? Now, if people are concerned about market interest rates, then even in the simple frame, where we just say $20 72 days from now, if market interest rates really play a role, well, they should be using these formulas in the simple frame as well. But they don't. They only use these formulas in the complex frame. It just doesn't seem, as an empirical matter, to be on the top of our subjects' minds what the market interest rates are. And also, as I said, I definitely appreciate your point about the censoring. But the rates we are using for experimental reasons, we can't pay people 72 years after they make the decision. So we have 72 days, and we compound daily. So these rates are far higher than whatever you get. Now, relatedly, implied discount factors, you're right. When you do the calculation, 72 days, 2 months, you do that to the power of 6, you get ridiculous numbers. What you assume when you calculate this implication is exponential discounting. And our data show us this is not what our people are doing. We ask them 48 days, we get a discount factor of 0.87. We ask them 72 days, we get a discount factor of 0.84.
With the standard deviation of 0.28?
I don't know.
Yeah, well, you told us in the paper, the standard deviation, we're talking about the representative agent. You're saying the discount factors are 0.04 different. You just told us that the standard deviation is 0.2. I think there's a bit of a gap there.
No, but that's the population level standard deviation. That's not the standard deviation of the mean, right? So we can do these calculations on the individual level, and it looks like, people put disproportionate weight on the present, as we know from a lot of behavioral economics. So I think in general it's interesting to look at that implication, but that implication relies on the assumption of exponential discounting, which in our case doesn't seem to be satisfied. The OLS on the averages, I don't think we actually do that. We use the individual decisions, and we just cluster standard errors by subjects. But yeah, I think that these are details. In general, the method is generalizable to other settings. It's not obvious how to do that well. We are working on this, and there's going to be more coming out. So thanks a lot for your interest and for your very nice discussion. Any questions?
John?
Could I ask about a couple of details that I think
Sure.
might influence your result? One is, I was puzzled by the language, at least on the slides. you say 1% compounded daily, and that means you get 1% per day.
Yeah.
But out there in the world, by law, that's not what 1% compounded daily means. So, going back to the Truth in Lending Act, 1968, rates have to be stated at an annual rate. So if a financial services provider quotes a rate 1% compounded daily, what that means is you get 1/365% per day, and you compound it daily. So I just worry about the shift in language from what the law has tried to establish as the standard, and whether anybody would be confused. I was confused. I misinterpreted it at first, until I realized what you were doing.
It's done in London though, right, not the US.
I know. What I think is comparable regulation in Britain is that regulators want all rates to be quoted on a comparable per year basis. Because why? Because that reduces financial confusion in the marketplace.
Right. So that's a great point. In that first paper, we assess the effects of education interventions. We have ineffective ones, we have effective ones, and what we see is that the effective one closes the gap. The difference between the ineffective and the effective ones is the addition of a practice stage. So the information is exactly the same. So empirically, it seems to be the case that our subjects aren't affected by this.
Okay, that's good.
I don't know how empirics can answer that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a latent comprehension issue. And just because you observe certain data doesn't follow that they understand that, or it doesn't bother them. I don't understand this general argument that, well, there's a theoretical problem, but it doesn't look like it's empirically. How can you uniquely connect those two? That's what I don't understand.
No, I'm thinking of a basic framework. It seems less likely given the data. I'm not saying I can totally rule out this.
So there's just one other thing I wanted to mention. I think there's some evidence, we have a student at Harvard who's working on this, that the scale of the number you give people influences the degree to which they misjudge compound interest. So, we have evidence that people don't intuitively get compound interest until they've been taught the rule of 72. But the sort of base rate of bias depends on whether you tell them you're talking about £1, £10, £1,000, or £100,000. Now, obviously, in the experiment, you can't afford to use large amounts, so you use small amounts. But that choice, I think, will influence the level of initial pre-education bias that you start with.
We've actually got a paper in Economica 2014 on the magnitude effect, and the reason is because of rounding. So very often people will round to the nearest dollar, or 50 cents, or 25 cents. If they round, actually reported dollars here, or tokens is your case, it's a pure rounding effect. As you scale up, you get rid of the rounding. If the rounding effect causes that, it causes hyperbolic behavior, it causes higher discount rates as well, and it hence will generate exactly that result. But so that's absolutely true. None of the papers I referenced go out 72 years. What they do is they have $500 principles. That's the way to get this to short horizons. So it's nothing to do with having to do 72 years.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. In general, it's a lab experiment, right? So we are not trying to claim external validity. We're not trying to claim that people in general have these kind of discount rates. All I've shown you are changes in financial competence. So we are not, I think for the substantive results of the paper, the levels are not that important. Basically all our analysis differences out of the levels. But that said, yes, of course, it's one more reason why you can't, why lab experiments sometimes have limited external validity.
I disagree. I think lab experiments are real people with real subjects, but that's a broader debate. I'm actually a fierce advocate for field experiments. I got a 2004 JEL survey with Liz. I'm writing a book for Princeton with him on field experiments. But you start in the lab because we've got to get the theory right. Then you go to the field.